Listen closely, for this is a story the elders still whisper when the moon hides its face. In a kingdom where rivers sang and forests breathed, there lived a maid named Nalia. She served in the royal palace where golden towers touched the clouds and gardens bloomed with flowers that never died. The queen was kind, her heart as pure as morning dew. She had just given birth to a son, a beautiful baby boy with eyes like starlight. But Nalia's heart was different. It was heavy with shadows she fed each day. While others celebrated the royal birth, Nalia felt something cold growing inside her chest. Envy, dark and bitter, wrapped around her ribs like thorns. One night, the queen asked Nalia to watch the baby while she rested. The assignment seemed simple enough. Just watch, just protect, just care. But Nalia stood in that nursery, staring at the sleeping infant, and her thoughts turned dangerous. The baby represented everything she would never have: love, importance, a future written in gold. Outside, the sacred river roared louder than usual, as if warning of the choice that was about to unfold. The baby stared, innocent and unaware, and Nalia's eyes grew cold. To understand what happened next, you must first understand Nalia's poison. She had not always been bitter. Once, long ago, Nalia had dreams of her own. She imagined marriage, children, a small house where laughter lived. But life had been cruel. Her family lost everything to drought and death. She entered the palace as a servant, watching others live the life she desired. Every day, she scrubbed floors while princesses danced above her head. She carried water while nobles sipped wine. She mended clothes she would never wear. And when the queen became pregnant, something inside Nalia cracked completely. The queen had everything: beauty, power, love, and now a child to carry her legacy forward. Nalia told herself she wasn't jealous. She told herself she was simply tired. But late at night, when she was alone, darker thoughts whispered in her mind. Thoughts she was ashamed to admit. Thoughts that asked terrible questions. What if the baby simply disappeared? She would push these thoughts away, horrified at herself. But they always returned, stronger each time. Like weeds, they grew in the garden of her heart, choking out whatever goodness remained. Now, standing in the nursery, those thoughts bloomed into something more dangerous: intention. The sacred river had rules older than memory itself. Village elders told stories about it during festivals, their voices low and serious. The river was alive, they said. It watched, it remembered, it judged. Never harm the innocent near the river's edge, the oldest grandmother would warn, her wrinkled finger pointing toward the water. The river keeps account of every cruelty, every abandonment, every selfish act. What you throw into its waters will return to you threefold. Some people believed these stories. Others laughed, calling them superstitions for frightened children. Nalia had heard the warnings many times. As a child, she had feared the power of the river, but years of hardship had made her skeptical. Magic and justice were fantasies, she decided. The world rewarded the clever, not the good. Still, on the night she was left alone with the baby, something strange happened. She walked to the window and looked out at the river, dark and churning under the moonlight. For a moment, she could swear she heard voices in the water's rush, whispers that sounded almost like her name: Nalia, Nalia. She shook her head, dismissing it as wind and imagination. The elders were old fools, she told herself. Rivers were just rivers. Water was just water. But the whispers continued, soft and persistent, like a warning she refused to hear. Exhaustion is a dangerous thing. It makes us careless. It makes us cruel. Nalia sat in a chair beside the baby's cradle, her eyes heavy with sleep. The queen had asked for just a few hours. Just watch him. Just keep him safe. A simple task that required only attention and care. But Nalia's resentment burned hotter than her sense of duty. Why should she lose sleep for someone else's child? Why should she sacrifice her rest for a baby who would grow up with everything while she had nothing? The baby cooed softly, his tiny fingers reaching toward the mobile hanging above his bed. He was so innocent, so unaware of the thought churning in her caretaker's mind. Nalia's eyelids grew heavier. Just a moment, she thought. Just a brief rest. What harm could come in a few minutes? She drifted into sleep and her dreams were dark and troubled. In them, she saw herself wearing the queen's crown, living the queen's life. In her dreams, the baby simply didn't exist. While she slept, the baby began to fuss, then squirm, then crawl. The cradle door had been left slightly open, the nursery door wasn't properly latched, and beyond, the palace garden led to the forest path, and the forest path led to the river. Thunder rumbled overhead, violent and sudden. When lightning flashed, the cradle was empty. Morning arrived with screams that shattered the palace peace. Nalia awoke with a start, her neck stiff from sleeping in the chair. For a confused moment, she couldn't remember where she was. Then memory crashed over her like cold water. The baby, the cradle, her duty. She rushed to the cradle and found it empty. Her heart stopped. Her blood went cold. For several long seconds, she couldn't breathe, couldn't think, couldn't move. Then panic took over. She searched the nursery frantically, looking under furniture, behind curtains, inside closets. Nothing. The baby was gone. The queen's anguished cry echoed through the palace when she learned the news. It was a sound that would haunt the kingdom for years, a mother's grief torn from the deepest part of her soul. Guards were summoned, the palace was searched, questions were asked, and Nalia made her choice. "Spirits," she whispered, her voice shaking with calculated fear. "I saw them, dark shadows that moved through the walls. I tried to stop them, but they were too powerful. They took him, they stole the prince." Her tears were real, born from guilt and terror, but everyone mistook them for sympathy and trauma. Instead of punishment, Nalia received comfort. Instead of blame, she received praise for surviving such a terrible supernatural attack. Her lie became truth, and truth became her burden. But the river had its own plans. Far downstream, where the forest grew thick and wild, an old woman lived in a small hut made of river stones. People called her the River Woman, though no one remembered her real name. Some said she was as old as the river itself. Others claimed she was the river's human form, walking among mortals to watch and judge. On the morning after the baby disappeared, she found him. He lay on the river bank, wrapped in royal cloth, now soaked and muddy. His tiny chest rose and fell with breath. Alive, protected. The river had carried him gently, never letting him drown, never letting him be crushed against the rocks. The river woman picked him up, her ancient eyes seeing more than the present moment. She saw the past, the betrayal, the sleeping maid, and she saw the future, the justice that would eventually unfold. "Little one," she whispered, "you are the returned one. The river saved you for a purpose." She pressed her thumb against his wrist, and a mark appeared there, a symbol that glowed faint blue like moonlight on water, the mark of the river's protection, the mark of one who would bring truth back to those who tried to bury it. The baby stopped crying and looked at her with those starlight eyes, as if he understood. Years passed like flowing water, and the baby became a boy, and the boy became a young man. The river woman raised him in her small village, where people lived simply but honestly. She named him Kale, which meant keeper of truth in the old language. He grew strong from swimming in the river and climbing forest trees. He grew kind from watching the river woman help every person who came to her door. But late at night, Kale had strange dreams. He saw a woman crying, her face beautiful but twisted with grief. He saw golden towers and gardens with impossible flowers, and he always walked with the same feeling. Something had been taken from him, and someone had done the taking. The mark on his wrist would glow faint blue during these dreams, pulsing like a heartbeat, remembering what his mind could not. In the palace, Nalia's life had transformed. After the tragedy, the queen could barely function. She withdrew from her duties, lost in grief that never healed. The king, overwhelmed by running the kingdom alone, needed help managing the household. Nalia, having survived the spirit attack, was promoted. First to head servant, then to household manager, then to the queen's personal attendant. With each promotion came more gold, more influence, more power. She wore fine clothes now. She ate the same food as the nobles. She gave orders instead of taking them. Everything she had envied, she now possessed. She should have been happy. She should have been satisfied. Instead, the nightmares came. Every night, the same dream. She stood by the river's edge, and the water rose around her ankles, then her knees, then her waist. She tried to run, but the current was too strong. The water pulled her under, filling her lungs, drowning her slowly. And always, just before she woke gasping, she heard a baby crying in the depths. She consulted healers who gave her herbs for sleep. She visited priests who performed cleansing rituals. Nothing helped. The nightmares continued, growing more vivid with each passing year. During the day, she smiled and managed the palace efficiently. But at night, the river claimed her, over and over, reminding her of what she had done. The kingdom itself began to change, and not for the better. It started with small things. A well that always gave clear water suddenly ran muddy. A field that had produced wheat for generations yielded only withered stalks. Children who were healthy one day fell ill mysteriously the next. The sacred river, which had always flowed strong and steady, began to shrink. Its banks widened as the water level dropped. Fish died by the thousands, floating belly up in the shallow pools that remained. Elders gathered in worried circles, reading signs that others couldn't see. "The balance is broken," they whispered. "A great injustice remains unpaid. The river is withholding its blessing until truth is restored." "What injustice?" younger people demanded. "The kingdom is well governed, the king is fair. What more does the river want?" But the oldest among them, those who understood the ancient ways, shook their heads. Not all crimes are visible. Not all sins are public. Somewhere, someone carries a secret that poisoned everything around them. A stolen life, an abandoned innocent, a lie that has lived too long. The king ordered sacrifices to the river. Priests performed ceremonies. Nothing worked. The river continued to die, and with it, the kingdom's prosperity faded like a dream upon waking. Crops failed, sickness spread, joy became scarce. And in the palace, Nalia watched the river shrink from her window, her heart knowing what her mouth would never confess. On the morning of Kael's 18th birthday, the river woman called him to the water's edge. He had known this day would come. He had felt it approaching like a storm gathering on the horizon. The mark on his wrist had been glowing brighter each night, pulsing with urgency. The river woman looked older than he had ever seen her, as if maintaining his protection had drained her life force. Her eyes were sad but determined. "It's time you knew the truth," she said, her voice like water over stones. "You are not born to this village. You were born in a palace, to a queen who loved you more than life itself." Kael's breath caught. He had suspected something, but hearing it spoken aloud made it real and terrifying. "Then why am I here?" "Because you were abandoned. A woman who should have protected you chose sleep and resentment instead. The river brought you to me before you could drown, before the forest could claim you. You are meant to die, but the river had other plans." She took his hand and placed it in the water. The mark on his wrist blazed brilliant blue, and suddenly Kael could see everything. The nursery, the sleeping maid, the crawling journey toward danger, his mother's screams the next morning. "What do I do?" he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "You return. Truth demands it. Justice requires it. But remember, truth will burn before it heals. Are you ready for that fire?" Kael looked at the dying river, then back at the only mother he had ever known. Yes. Kael arrived at the palace gates dressed as a traveling scholar, his true identity hidden beneath simple clothes and a humble manner. The guards barely glanced at him, just another visitor seeking the king's wisdom or the court's charity. They waved him through without question. But as Kael walked through the palace gardens, where flowers bloomed in defiance of the kingdom's decay, someone watched him from a high window. Nalia. She had been reviewing household accounts when something made her look up. A young man crossing the garden, his walk confident but not arrogant, his bearing somehow familiar. Her heart began to pound for no reason she could name. Her hands started to shake, spilling ink across the parchment. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead. She told herself she was ridiculous. He was just a visitor, just a stranger. just a young man who looked like 1,000 other young men. But then, he paused by the fountain and turned his face toward her window. Even from that distance, she saw his eyes, starlight eyes that she had last seen 18 years ago, reaching up from a cradle toward a mobile of silver birds. And when he lifted his hand to shield his eyes from the sun, she saw it, a mark on his wrist that glowed faint blue in the daylight. The river's mark. The impossible had happened. The dead had returned. And Nalia knew with terrible certainty that her past had finally come to collect its debt. The queen spent most of her days in the garden where she had last held her son. 18 years of grief had carved lines into her face that age alone could never create. She was still beautiful, but it was a broken beauty, like a vase that had been shattered and carefully glued back together. The cracks still showed. She sat on her favorite bench when Kael found her, though he didn't yet know who she was. "Forgive me," he said softly, not wanting to startle her. "I'm looking for the audience hall." The queen looked up, ready to give directions. Then she saw his face, and something shifted in her chest, a recognition that made no logical sense. She had never seen this young man before. She would have remembered those eyes. "It's that way," she managed, pointing with a trembling hand. "Are you seeking something specific?" "The truth," Kael said simply, "about something that happened here long ago." The queen studied him more carefully now. There was something about his features, the shape of his jaw, the way he tilted his head when he spoke. It reminded him of... But no, that was impossible. Her son was gone. The spirits had taken him. "Perhaps," Kael agreed, "but secrets have a way of poisoning everything around them, even gardens." They talked for an hour, though neither could remember what words were actually spoken. They only remembered the feeling, a connection that defied explanation, a comfort that felt like coming home. That night, exhausted from his journey, Kael slept in the guest quarters the queen had insisted he take. And in his sleep, he whispered a single word that the queen heard through her door: "Mother." Nalia's hands shook as she poured the queen's evening tea. The young stranger had been at the palace for 3 days now, and every moment felt like a noose tightening around her neck. She had tried to convince herself she was imagining. He couldn't be the baby. That baby had drowned or been taken by animals or simply died from exposure 18 years ago. But the mark, the eyes, the way the queen looked at him with hope she hadn't shown in nearly 2 decades. Nalia knew, and knowing terrified her. She began plotting in the desperate way of cornered animals. Perhaps if the stranger left, perhaps if he met an accident, perhaps if he simply disappeared like he had once before. She went to a guard she knew was greedy. "That stranger," she whispered, pressing coins into her palm. "He's not what he seems. I've heard him speaking about overthrowing the king. Send him away, tonight." But the guard, looking into her panicked eyes, saw something that made him uncomfortable. He took the coins, but did nothing. Next, she tried poison, just a small amount in the stranger's wine at dinner, just enough to make him sick, to force him to leave, to break whatever spell he was weaving around the queen. She watched him drink, waited for him to clutch his stomach, waited for the plan to work. But Kael simply set down his cup and smiled at something the queen said. The wine remained in his stomach, harmless. When servants cleared the dishes, they found the wine had turned black in the cup, as if the liquid itself had absorbed and neutralized the poison. The river's protection was absolute. The elders heard about the stranger and demanded answers. "If he claims connection to the royal family," the chief elder announced, "let him face the river test. The sacred stone will reveal his truth or his lies." The river test was ancient law. A person placed their hand on a stone carved from the riverbed itself. If they lied, nothing happened. If they spoke truth, the stone glowed with the river's blessing. No one actually performed the test in decades. Most people assumed it was ceremonial rather than supernatural. But the elders insisted, and the king, curious about the stranger who had brought life back to his grieving wife, agreed. The entire court gathered by the dying river. The sacred stone sat on a platform, grey and unremarkable, covered with symbols from the old language. Kael approached it calmly, though his heart raced. The river woman told him this moment would come. She said, "The river knows you. It has always known you. Trust in that." "Place your hand on the stone," the chief elder commanded, "and speak your claim." Kael pressed his palm against the cool surface. The mark on his wrist began to glow, faint at first, then brighter. "I am the son who was abandoned, the child who was saved, the truth that was buried." For 3 heartbeats, nothing happened. The crowd held their breath. Then the stone blazed with blue light, the same color as Kael's mark. The light spread across the stone's surface, illuminating the symbols, making them pulse and dance. And everyone saw, carved among the ancient words, the same mark that glowed on Kael's wrist. The river's mark, the mark of the protected one, the mark of the prince. Kael stood before the assembled court, his voice steady despite the chaos his revelation had caused. "Someone in this palace," he said clearly, "chose sleep over duty, chose resentment over care, chose to let an innocent child crawl toward death rather than fulfill a simple promise to watch and protect." The queen had collapsed into a chair, her hand over her mouth, tears streaming down her face. Up and horror warred in her expression. Could it be true? Could this be her son? "I make no accusation," Kael continued, "except to say that truth lives in this room, even if it hides behind lies. The river remembers everything. The river forgets nothing. And the river has brought me here to restore what was stolen." He turned slowly, letting his gaze sweep across every face. Nobles shifted uncomfortably. Servants looked at their feet. Guards stood at attention, unsure what was happening. But when his eyes landed on Nalia, something electric passed between them. Recognition, certainty, terror. She tried to maintain her composure. She tried to stand tall and meet his gaze with innocent confusion. But her body betrayed her. Her face went white. Her knees buckled. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps. "It wasn't my fault," she suddenly screamed, the words tearing from her throat before she could stop them. "I was tired. I was so tired. I only closed my eyes for a moment. Just a moment." The court went completely silent. Nalia clapped her hand over her mouth, realizing what she had just confessed. But the words hung in the air, impossible to take back. The truth, after 18 years of hiding, had finally been spoken aloud. The sacred river, which had been dying for years, suddenly came alive. Without warning, water surged from upstream, flooding the village square where the court had gathered. But it was strange water, controlled and purposeful. It rose quickly but didn't harm anyone. It simply surrounded them, ankle deep, making it impossible to leave. The river woman appeared, walking across the water's surface as if it were solid ground. She looked younger now, more powerful, as if the river's return had restored her strength. "The river demands its due," she announced, her voice carrying across the crowd without shouting. "An injustice has lived too long. A child was abandoned, a mother grieved, a kingdom suffered, all because one woman chose convenience over conscience." She pointed at Nalia, who stood frozen in the water, her expensive dress soaking and heavy. Nalia made sounds like a wounded animal, but she couldn't stop now. The words came faster, 18 years of guilt finally finding release. "It wasn't my fault," she sobbed, water now up to her thighs. "I was tired. I was so tired. I only closed my eyes for a moment, Just a moment. The court went completely silent. Nalia clapped her hand over her mouth, realizing what she had just confessed. But the words hung in the air, impossible to take back. The truth, after 18 years of hiding, had finally been spoken aloud. The transformation happened slowly, beautifully, and terribly all at once. Nalia's skin took on a faint blue glow, like moonlight on water. Her body became semi-translucent, not quite solid, not quite spirit. She remained herself, but changed, marked forever by the river's judgment. You will walk the river banks, the river woman pronounced, from sunset to sunrise every night for as long as the river flows. You will watch for children who wander too close. You will rescue those who stumble. You will protect the innocent you once abandoned. The curse, or blessing depending on how one saw it, settled into Nalia's bones. She would never age now, never die, never rest, but she would also have purpose, a way to repay the debts she could never fully settle. During the day, she would live among humans, remembering what she was. But when night fell, she became the river's guardian. She would save 1,000 children, and still her debt would not be paid. But perhaps, after centuries, she would understand the weight of the care she once treated so carelessly. Nalia looked at her glowing hands, at the cut that stared at her with mixed horror and fascination. Then she looked at Kale, who met her gaze with something that wasn't quite hatred, but also wasn't hatred. "Thank you," she whispered. "Death would have been easier, but this lets me matter. This lets me help. I accept it." As the sun set that very evening, Nalia walked to the river's edge. Her form became more ethereal, more ghost than woman, and she began her eternal watch. Rain started falling for the first time in years, gentle, healing, necessary. The river, satisfied with justice finally served, began to return to life. The palace prepared for a ceremony unlike any in its history. The sacred stone's proof was undeniable. Kale's story, confirmed by the river woman, and Nalia's confession left no doubt. The lost prince had returned. But as servants prepared crowns and nobles planned celebrations, Kale stood before them in the garden with his true mother, the queen who had grieved for 18 years. She held his face in her hands, tears streaming down her cheeks, unable to stop touching him as if he feared he might disappear again. "My son, my baby, I thought you were dead. I thought I had lost you forever." "You never lost me," Kale said gently. "The river kept me safe. The river woman raised me well. And every night, without knowing it, I dreamt of you." They held each other, and years of separation began to heal in that embrace. But the healing was bittersweet. They had lost so much time, so many moments that could never be recovered. The king approached them both, his true parents, and felt the weight of destiny settling on their shoulders. He had remarried after the queen had become too lost in grief to fulfill her duties. The political situation was delicate. A returned prince changed everything. "Tomorrow," the king said carefully, "we will hold the ceremony. The kingdom will know its prince has returned. But after that, you must choose. A crown comes with chains. Power comes with sacrifice. You must decide if that's the life you want." Kale stood before them both, his true parents, and felt the weight of destiny settling on his shoulders. He looked at the crown being prepared, gleaming with jewels and promise, and he hesitated. The entire kingdom gathered for the ceremony, curious to see the prince who had returned from death itself. Kale stood before the throne, dressed in royal clothing that felt strange against his skin. He had spent 18 years in simple tunics and river water. Now silk and velvet surrounded him, beautiful but constraining. The crown sat on a velvet pillow, waiting to be placed on his head. It would make everything official, make him prince in law as well as blood. The king prepared to speak the traditional words. The court held its breath, but Kale raised his hand, asking for a moment. He looked out at the gathered people, nobles and servants, rich and poor, all watching him with expectation. "I accept my birthright," he said clearly. "I am the queen's son. I am the lost prince returned. This I do not dispute." The crowd murmured with approval, but Kale wasn't finished. "However, a crown means nothing if the person wearing it hasn't learned what matters. I was abandoned, but I was also saved. I was raised not in luxury, but in truth. The river taught me that power without compassion is tyranny, that privilege without responsibility is poison." He picked up the crown and held it up to the light. "I will wear this. I will serve this kingdom, but I will rule as the river taught me, with fairness, with mercy, with justice that heals rather than harm." He placed the crown on his own head, a symbolic gesture that he chose his role rather than being forced upon him. "I am Kale, son of water and truth, and I will serve." The crowd erupted in cheers. The river woman, watching from the shadows, smiled and disappeared. Her work was done. The changes began immediately, rippling outward like stones thrown into water. The sacred river, satisfied that justice had been served, returned to its full strength. Water flowed clear and cold again. Fish returned to its depths. The banks bloomed with flowers that had withered for nearly 2 decades. Crops that had been failing suddenly produced abundant harvests. Children who were sick recovered their health. The very air seemed cleaner, lighter, as if a weight had been lifted from the entire kingdom. Kale established new laws that protected the vulnerable and held the powerful accountable. He created a council that included not just nobles, but also common people, ensuring that everyone's voice could be heard. He personally oversaw orphanages and schools, remembering his own journey from abandoned baby to educated young man. Every child, he declared, deserved the chance he had been given by the river woman's kindness. The queen, reunited with her son, found joy returning to her life like spring after endless winter. She and Kale walked the gardens together every day, making up for lost time with shared stories and laughter. But Kale never forgot where he came from. He visited the river woman's village regularly, listening to the wisdom of those who lived simply but honestly. He kept his old clothes, his old ways of thinking. The crown sat on his head, but the river remained in his heart. Elders watched his rule and nodded with approval. "This is what leadership should be," they said. "Not power for its own sake, but service with wisdom. Not revenge, but restoration." The kingdom thrived as it hadn't in generations. But what of Nalia, the woman whose choices had started this entire story? Every night as the sun set, villagers would see her walking the riverbanks. Her glowing form moved with purpose, watching for children who strayed too close to the water, rescuing those who stumbled on slippery rocks, guiding lost wanderers back to safety. She never spoke during her nightly rounds. She simply served, a guardian born from guilt but sustained by purpose. During the day, she lived in a small cottage the kingdom provided. She looked like a normal woman then, her glow faded, her curse dormant. She helped in the village, teaching children to swim, helping repair riverside homes, always serving, always trying to repay a debt that could never be fully paid. Some people feared her, others pitied her, but most came to respect her. She had done something terrible, but she was spending eternity trying to make it right. Once, years after the revelation, Kael came to visit her. She was mending a fishing net when she saw him approaching, and her hands stilled with nervous anticipation. "Your Highness," she said, bowing low. "Just Kael," he corrected gently. "I came to thank you." She looked up, confused. "Thank me? For what?" for teaching me the most important lesson I've ever learned, that people are more than their worst mistakes, that justice should restore, not destroy, that mercy is strength, not weakness. Nalia's eyes filled with tears. I don't deserve your gratitude. I don't deserve anything but the curse I bear. Perhaps, Kael said, but the curse is also a gift. You matter now. You protect. You serve. That's more than many people ever do. He left her with those words, and Nalia watched the sun set, feeling something she hadn't felt in years. Peace, perhaps. Or maybe just the beginning of redemption. Years became decades, and Kael's story spread throughout the kingdom and beyond. Parents told it to their children by firelight, their voices dropping to serious tones as they described the maid who slept when she should have watched, the river that saved an innocent baby, and the prince who chose mercy over vengeance. What lesson do you take from this story? The storytellers would ask, leaning forward with eyes that gleamed in the flickering light. Children would offer different answers. Some said the lesson was about doing your duty. Others said it was about the power of mercy. Still others focused on how every action has consequences that ripple outward, affecting more people than we can imagine. All the answers held truth. In distant lands, travelers would speak of the water prince and his eternal guardian. Some made pilgrimages to see the sacred river. Others came seeking Kael's wisdom on matters of justice and governance. The story evolved and changed as all stories do, but its core remained solid, a child abandoned, a river that remembered, a justice that healed rather than destroyed. Kael himself would sometimes walk among the people in disguise, listening to how they told his story. He never corrected their embellishments or creative additions. Stories, he knew, belonged to everyone who told them. The only thing he insisted on was this, that every version, no matter how changed, included the truth about Nalia, not as a villain to be hated, but as a person who made a terrible mistake and spent forever trying to make it right. Because that complexity, he believed, was what made the story worth telling. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our tale, though its lessons continue forever. The kingdom still thrives under rulers who remember Kael's example. The sacred river still flows, powerful and eternal, watching over the land with patient justice. And on quiet nights, if you walk the river banks, you might see a glowing figure moving through the darkness, watching, protecting, serving. The moral of this story is simple yet profound. Neglecting the innocent may sleep quietly for a time, but justice never does. The river remembers what we try to forget. Truth buried will eventually grow back toward the light, no matter how deep we bury it. Nalia learned that power and privilege built on another's suffering becomes a prison without bars. The queen learned that even the deepest grief can be transformed by expected grace. And Kael learned that the strength to show mercy often requires more courage than the impulse toward revenge. What you do when no one is watching matters more than what you do when all eyes are upon you. A moment of carelessness can echo for generations, but a moment of mercy can heal wounds that seemed permanent. So I ask you now, as storytellers have asked for centuries, what lesson do you take from this story? Will you choose duty over convenience, protection over sleep, truth over comfortable lies? And when someone fails you terribly, will you choose revenge or restoration? The river is always watching, and like the river, the consequences of our choices flow forward forever, reaching places we never imagined. Choose wisely.